being at 17%, this is bad, and historically so. And it just does mean that there is something new that's gone wrong. So I don't think this is the end of the Labour Party. I don't think it's the end of the world as we know it. I do think, but if we're looking for something that, like, hey, this is new and this is historically different, reaching below 20%, that's a thing.
Hi guys, and thanks for joining our end of week roundup. We're looking to do these podcasts to summarise the week's news cycle, any particular stories we've found interesting, and to highlight some of the longer form content we produce. We've got Miles, who's our editor.
Hello.
And we've got Alex, who runs our longer form deep dive content. And today we're discussing the local election results. Reform, it's an undoubted success for Reform and for the Greens. Alex, do you think this represents the end of the two-party system in the UK, or at least a splintering of that?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's not exactly a surprise to anyone, the kind of vague direction of these results. Obviously, polling has been indicating something in this direction for a while. But I think, the interesting element of this is not just kind of the collapse of the sort of, as you say, the two major parties, but also the kind of realignment that you've had with a lot of the smaller parties that have been kind of subsumed inside of these two larger parties. A lot of the sort of localist realignment is maybe a little bit of a kind of under-considered aspect of this. That here in Essex, for instance, a lot of the sort of local residents associations have kind of been subsumed into Reform, as part of their sort of electoral coalition there. So that's kind of also an interesting element.
Miles, what do you think? Do you think it's a splintering of the two-party system, or do you think it represents something a bit different?
No, I think it is the splintering of the two-party system. I think that we've now got 5, 6, or 7 parties, depending on how you count it. And it will surprise nobody on this call that I think this is a result of what the internet's doing to us. I think that if we look at a lot of these parties, these are not broad-based parties with like clear policies or ideologies. They are speaking to segments of the electorate about what segments of the electorate want to be talking about, and whether that's the Greens on climate change and sort of justice in the Middle East, if we want to talk about reform and immigration and political correctness and how mad it has gotten. I think the Conservatives and Labour Party are really challenged by this because they just don't have a sort of reason for being in this new space where we're all being broken down by our marketing categories. And we're all sort of, we're being filtered into these bubbles where we might not. It's not only that we might not hear from sort of opposing politicians. It's also that we might not be considering issues that would perhaps change our views. So I don't think Green Party supporters are getting fed as much fiscal discipline worries as I am. I'm not sure that Liberal Democrats are getting fed as much immigrant crime rhetoric as perhaps Reform voters are. I think we're seeing these echo chambers sort of start to breach into the real world, and I don't know what that means. I'm pretty sure it doesn't mean anything good.
No, and that's exactly what it is, right? Echo chambers, and the idea of having your views reinforced is not a new thing. We all know of newspaper biases and news outlet biases, etc. But when it's so targeted, and it becomes extremely divisive, and you find that people are arguing about they're arguing about societal issues rather than actual policy or anything like that, aren't they? Right, and that is a result of this big split. Before we get on to Reform specifically, how damaging do we think this is to Labour, Mars?
So this is historically bad for Labour. So last year they scored 20% at local elections, but before that they've always scored in somewhere between in the low 20s to the mid 40s, depending on where they are in the electoral cycle. They can go a lot. They usually go a lot lower in local elections when they're in government, when they're about to be kicked out of government, than they will ever get in a general election. But yeah, like being at 17%, this is bad, and historically so. And it just does mean that there is something new that's gone wrong. So I don't think this is the end of the Labour Party. I don't think it's the end of the world as we know it. But I do think, but if we're looking for something that like, hey, this is new and this is historically different, reaching below 20%, that's a thing.
So I think you've kind of answered this, but a question something I wondered, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with this point, but your first answer said, this is what the internet's doing to us. Do we think that any party that was in this climate, in the position that the Labour Party is in, would suffer these kind of results? Or like you said, is this both reflective of the internet culture and reflective of the Labour Party?
I think it is definitely both. So Labour are the incumbent, and the incumbents for the last couple of years, incumbents have just been getting kicked up and down the ballot paper. It's been brutal, and like no incumbent is loving it. Viktor Orban is not loving it. So it's not like there's anybody who's got the answer to this. It's so much easier to be against something and than for it. On the other hand, the Labour Party has not been for very much. Gun to your head. What are Labour policies? What is this government for? Give me the 30-second lift pitch, because I can't give it to you.
Yes.
And I think the reason for that is because Labour went into 2024 as the knock the Tories out party, which they did, and it was a very successful. It was a very successful message for them, and but the problem is that they knocked the Tories out on literally the day they were elected. So, like, the mission taking them forward had already been completed remarkably well. And so now what? And there's a real, like, what is this government for? And I couldn't tell you.
Alex?
Well, I mean, I'm going to do something maybe a little unusual, which is to completely agree with Miles on the internet point, on it being a thing of the internet, in the sense that it's always been the case that local elections have not been very local, that they have been on national issues, because in the British system, sadly, in the recesses between parliamentary election, the only way of kind of letting your dissatisfaction or, in the rare event, satisfaction with the government known is through local elections. And that means often that a lot of local elections are not really decided on the issues locally at all, but on whether or not they want to, send a message to the national government. And, this is hardly a new point, but the kind of precipitous decline of local media, of locally kind of based political communities, and it's sort of, it being subsumed into this sort of national and international sort of, internet-based media ecosystem. I mean, it's kind of hard not to kind of bear that in mind when you look at the results. When you see, a lot of these sort of localist parties, this is kind of, I think, one of the things that has been under-considered. You've seen a massive slaughtering of localist parties in this round of local elections, and they have been completely subsumed into reform, mainly into reform, because mainly that's where their sort of, their policies lie. But you've also seen, the few independents that you have had, have been talking about local issues in large part. The Independent Alliance in Birmingham, for instance, does do a lot of stuff about, the bin strike and about, a lot of really terrible things that are happening locally, but are also combined with a lot of totally non-local issues that are, the Gaza independents, as the sort of Independent Alliance people were often called, that is a group which wants to influence government foreign policy, as its kind of, one of its main electoral objectives. And obviously that is one of the ways that you do that in a system where you don't have, parliament elections, every year. And you have to, that's the way that you let your voice be heard. But it's, I think it is interesting to see kind of this as the kind of summit, I suppose, of that kind of trend, of the shift away from local based politics to a sort of a kind of conglomerated, massive kind of internet-based, I guess, global politics often.
So how does that interact with um, the SNP and Plaid Cymru doing so well? Um, does that mean that, because obviously those are local forces, but does that mean that Reform are also attracting, creating some form of English nationalism? If it's able to mop up those sort of residents' association, those sort of local independents, um, is that what's going on? Are we seeing Reform become an English national, or even more of an English national party?
I mean, I don't know what other people's kind of thoughts on this are, but anecdotally, I have a friend who's a very staunch Welsh nationalist, which up to them was a bit of a lonely kind of profession. But he found that he has experienced a big, obviously he has kind of witnessed the massive explosion of Plaid Cymru firsthand. I think it is interesting to note how little to do with Welsh nationalism he believes the kind of new influx, of supporters are. That often they are. It's not merely that they support, the progressive politics of Plaid Cymru. He thinks, but that they do believe in Welsh independence. But they believe in Welsh independence in a very clinical way, in a way of Reform are going to win in Westminster. I don't want to be ruled by Reform, so I want Wales to be independent, regardless of any kind of particular affiliation to Welsh sort of nationalism as a kind of underlying ideology. And that sort of, that clinical nationalism, you've heard kind of similar rhetoric, from a lot of SNP drifting voters of, less about sort of Scottish nationhood, but a lot more about the idea of fear of a kind of England, which, as you say, I think you're right, a Reform Party which is far more English oriented and in the eyes of many Scottish and Welsh people reflects, a nation with a just wildly different kind of political direction to them, I guess. I mean, Harry, what do you make of that?
Like, so I suppose what I think is, what I find interesting. So, hands up, my history, my background is in covering the military and foreign affairs, international politics. I can't really get into the weeds of local stuff, like in the answer you've just given. I don't know the ins and the outs, but what I do find interesting is the identity politics of it, the um the sort of attaching yourself to something based on a very small sample of policy and being completely dedicated to something based on identity, whether that's national identity, like extreme localization, or whether it's like you were speaking about in Birmingham, like directly associating yourself with something that's happening halfway around the world, but you want to vote domestically because of a foreign policy that you identify with and basing your political opinions on that thing. I think is quite interesting, and that is Reform is. I saw a video that went around prior to the election results about a guy dressed up in a Union Jack suit pretending to be a Reform voter, asking Reform voters
Mm,
what they liked other
sure.
than immigration policy, and none of them can really answer it. And you're like, well, like that is in my view, that is the
No.
crux of this. It's an identity politics thing, and it is whether you want to get into the immigration debate, whether or not we can have, to Miles's point, on the internet and the sort of divisive nature that we now find ourselves in, whether or not you can have a rational, reasonable, informed debate about immigration is kind of is the problem. And so what fills the gap is Reform, enters the vacuum, makes it very clear that that's what they stand for and that's what they see as the problem. And then people they either attach to that and identify with that, or they don't and they go into one of the other parties. But it doesn't seem to be like there's not a lot of crossover there. And whether that's applied to like Welsh nationalism, Scottish nationalism, any form of it, I think is what I
Well,
find
I
quite
think you
interesting.
could say the same thing about the Greens. So if people are worried about climate change, or and in some places more worried about Gaza, and just sort of peace more generally is what I'd say. Sort of stop the war, sort of stuff. Like that's an identity, but it's a strange thing to have to choose from these parties that all represent, because their identities are so thin. Like what am I in favour of? Am I in favour of endless bombing of Gaza? No, not really. Do I want? Am I against? Do I worry and care about climate change? Yeah, I do. Do I? Um, do I want? Fiscal discipline, sort of Tory style? Yeah, I'll have some of that. Do I want to oppose Trump muscularly like the Liberal Democrats? Yeah, I'll have some of that too. Do I want to build a house ever like the Labour Party keeps promising, but doesn't seem to be delivering? Yeah, that would also be great. Like I don't like. It's a strange thing to be. It's more about how are people making this decision? Are they prioritizing? Are they saying, right, immigration is my number one, and that's why I'm voting for reform, or are they saying? The NHS is my number one, and that's why I'm voting for Labour. But if I could have Labour in health and reform in at the Home Office, would I vote for that? I don't. I have no idea what people are thinking. It's a tough place. So I don't envy us making these decisions.
So to move the conversation on slightly, Miles, obviously you've got a background. I don't know if you want to explain to the listeners and the viewers maybe a little bit about your background in polling and sort of grassroots political sort of movements. I don't know if you briefly wanted to explain that.
Yeah, so I've been knocking around politics for almost a quarter of a century, fighting local elections, general elections. I've stood as a candidate. I've worked at Conservative Central Office. I've even run a small polling company. So I've been around watching this, and the nice thing about being around for so long is that you realize that all of your knowledge and insight is completely worthless because it keeps getting overturned. And let's not big up my background too much.
But I suppose the reason I wanted you to introduce that, that part of your life and explain to the listeners what that you've done, that is now to get sort of into the weeds of reform. They have had undoubtedly a massive success here. How do you think that changes on the ground level? What do you think that changes? Because they haven't, they will now. I read an article that was saying like Reform are going to tell you that they've, they've got the momentum and they're running things now, or they'll behave in that way, which obviously isn't true. But how do you think this changes the political atmosphere and the political climate in the UK, or does it not? Did we know this was going to happen and we just roll with it now?
So I think the temptation is to ask us, is this like when Labour overtook the Liberals? And Labour had been a smaller party that was based on trade unions. It was a party of protest, and then suddenly it was a party of government. And both the Conservatives and Liberals in some ways supported them to become a party of government. And so I think what a lot of people are waiting for is reform to become serious, to become, appoint somebody sensible as, maybe even appoint a defense spokesman, that sort of, the sort of deep levels of seriousness of like naming even somebody who can speak to defense. I don't think that's going to happen. And I also don't think it's necessary for them to win a general election. I think we're in quite a silly moment. So I would be, but I do think, but part of what I do think is going to happen is that Reform previously have been a very thin party. They've been the Nigel show. And that has meant that people can't name half a dozen people in Reform, which is fair enough. They only had half a dozen MPs. It's not, it's a bit unfair of me to expect that. But what will happen now is that so Reform now have what? They've gained 14, I think, councils in this election. They gained 20. They gained another 10 last election. They've got real leaders and real people in government. And the other thing is they just have more people. They have 1,500 councillors elected. And these people and their quality, what they say, these are going to start to reflect on Reform a bit more, partly because these people are where they'll be able to draw their parliamentary candidates. And sort of who gets the nod to be a parliamentary candidate, that will matter, either if Reform get into government or into parliament, but also like these are people who will have a voice to create news, and that news can be either positive or negative. They can be, they can start to garner their own social media followings and influences. They can start to talk about things that they care about. So at the moment, if you want to ask about any reform policy, it's just like, what's Nigel ready to clip off a glib answer about? And like eventually, if they they will have spokespeople who will get asked these questions, and when they make, and depending, maybe one day they'll sort of carve out their own policy agenda, sort of RFK Jr. like. He's definitely got a strong policy agenda. Well, strongest. He has got a very clear policy agenda on health that I don't think Trump really knows about, and perhaps Nigel will run his party like that. Or you might end up with more gaffe-prone people who are saying the quiet part out loud all the time and undermining Nigel's appeal to sort of remaining conservative in Lib Dem areas, which is where he will have to start to, really make inroads.
Yeah, because I think the thing that I find particularly, sort of concerning about reform, particularly, and as you could, I mean, I suppose some people could level the same at the Greens, but my issue with reform is they're very good at being disruptors. How much faith do we have in them actually being able to, it's easy to break something. It's a bit harder to put it back together. How, they, like Nigel Farage has made recently in British politics, with the Brexit vote and then disappearing off into the background and then entering national politics again because someone gave him £5 million. Like how much faith do we have in like he's rounded up his merry band of former Tories and is now, soundbite after soundbite, but how much faith do we have in him actually putting forward policy or putting forward things? Like the policy's been picked apart. Some of it's been proven to be like fiscally like absurd. Alex, like, how much of a threat is it that he actually is he being disruptive again? Or, to Miles's point, like, is he being disruptive again, or like, are other people saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, or is there going to be a bit more of a serious stance now they've had this sort of foundation built?
I think that's a really good question. And I guess, maybe the answer would be, how has that impacted them so far? It's they have been in charge now of the Kent County Council for over a year. We are beginning to see kind of people are experiencing firsthand kind of the material impact of, reform's actual ideas about how to govern things, and what that means in practice. We haven't seen, over that period, we've seen, I guess reform's share of the vote continue to rise. I
No, we
think,
haven't. They've fallen back slightly this year. I mean,
but
ever so slightly, but
averaging since May, aren't they slightly up? May of this year compared to May of last year. Didn't they peak around November of last year and have sort of slowly? You're the poll expert. If I'm off, which there's a
I have
high chance of.
previous suggestion that they've dropped so BBC projected national share of the vote through Patrick English, who's head of elections and politics at YouGov. I saw shared this morning that reform's actually dropped by 4 points, I think.
But to be
that's
fair,
from last year. So they're on 26%. Greens are on 18, Labour 17, Conservatives 17, Lib Dem 16.
Sorry, I've seen that bandied. Yes, that's absolutely true. But of course, these are different local elections. As in, the local elections this time round are a lot more urban and were ones where reform were expected to do, less. As in, Birmingham is up for election. Obviously, a lot of London boroughs are up for election. More London boroughs than last time. It's. I guess yes, absolutely. That. It is lower than last time, but it is in areas where you would expect reform to do less well.
That number is weighted up though.
Yes,
but on the other hand, it's a hard thing to weight up from such different places, and to have gaps is the real challenge, because what might be happening in some places that are more likely to vote for reform might not be happening at all in places. So it is weighted up, but basically, I think we're within the margin of error. Like, I don't think we can say reform is on the march, except for the fact that they have scored 10% better than any other political party. That seems significant.
Yeah, I was going to say that's arguing about who's gone up, who it doesn't, they're like you said, at 10% ahead. That's the takeaway, right? Like, I think that's the bit that, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting that, that the Conservatives. What do we make of the Conservatives' performance here as the supposed de facto opposition? Miles, obviously, you are probably well equipped to speak on this. What do you think about the Conservatives' performance here?
Yeah, so for the Conservatives, I think this is so similar to Labour. I think being below 20% for the Conservatives, this is historically bad, and so this is definitely not a return to any sort of good times for the Conservatives or Labour. This is a problem. On the other hand, what we're not seeing is a collapse, is a complete collapse in the Conservative vote. So Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, they're all on similar levels of vote share, and so they're all still in the mix. I think that the Conservatives, so the danger for the Conservatives here is that Reform become the default opposition to Labour. So at a general election, there are general elections, and we've just seen one in 2024, where the general election is just kick the rascals out. And if we get into a kick the rascals out election, then the question will be, who is the default opposition? So when people think, I want to kick Labour, who are the first people that jump to their minds? If it's the Conservatives, they're likely to do very well. And frankly, I think the Conservative stock is quite sort of under, I'd be buying it right now. I think it's cheap. They get a new leader. So I was around when David Cameron first became leader, and indeed I was around for a few years before that. And political parties are very different animals within them. But like the Conservative Party, I say they're like dogs. When they're leaderless, they're quite dangerous. They go off in all sorts of different directions. But as soon as you give them a leader, suddenly it all gels together, and stuff really starts to happen. And I think the Conservatives, with a decent leader and a anti-Labour wind at their back, I think they could suddenly roar back, and it'll be like they never left. But this is the most perilous I've ever seen it. On the other hand, and there is a question of if Reform get that anti-Labour vote at a general election, that it could be curtains for them.
Because sorry, go on, Alex. What were you gonna?
Oh, well, no, I mean, how do you see them winning that back, I guess, the kind of credible, I guess, position as being the anti-Labour party? Because, as you say, at the moment, they kind of don't really have that in most places.
So I think some of this is stylistic. So I think there are a lot of people in the middle who maybe would consider voting Lib Dem, but 9 out of 10 times vote Tory. And they just don't want to vote Reform. And I think there are people for whom that will be the case going forwards. But the question is, and I think we're seeing that in the Conservatives, 17%. But those people could fall in a massive anti-Labour wave. If the priority of the country is to get Labour out of government, that could fall low. That could, Conservatives could end up in dark days of Liberal Democrat territory of like 5-10%. And that's the end of the line, because but if the Conservatives were to have a credible looking leader and a credible looking cabinet sort of suddenly, if they were to do things like apologize for Liz Truss, explain, if they had a leader who could clearly explain that Boris getting drunk during COVID, surrounded by a load of staffers, was bad actually, and they wouldn't do that in that same situation. Like the country will not forgive you unless you ask them for forgiveness. It's not hard. They shouldn't be trusted until they can tell right from wrong, and they won't be. So yeah, credible leader, ask for forgiveness, present a strong face against Labour, and then have a policy that people like. And these are not ridiculously high bars. And suddenly, the press, the money, and importantly, all of the careerists will start flooding into the Conservative Party. All of the talented young people who want to be in or around government, suddenly they will start showing up at the Conservative Party. The inverse of that is that if Reform can do the same thing, that'll be the end of that'll be the Conservative Party will be finished. But it's a hard thing for Reform to do. Obviously, Reform can't really change their leader. The policies of Reform, actually, I think the policies of Reform are probably acceptable, and indeed they are getting normalised day in and day out. So they're both getting not explained and normalised. So nobody knows what Reform's ICE force are going to look like, and we never will until they're in government. But the real question is the money in Reform is going well, although on quite a shallow basis, on the basis of few very large donors. But yeah, if Reform looks like the default against Labour, and if Reform, and also sort of viscerally, like, I want to hurt the Labour Party, who should I vote for to do that? Like, that could spell the end. So yeah, I am worried.
Yeah. I mean, 2 points. Firstly, someone should definitely apologise for Liz Truss on your point. That absolutely needs to happen. But secondly, you mentioned there about careerists, and I don't think it matters whether it's the Conservatives or Labour, but is there an argument to say that we're here because of careerist politics? We're here because of, people are people bored of hearing from careerist politicians? Are people bored of hearing from? Is Reform and Green a response to that? Whether or not you agree with the politics and the principles, are these parties a response to people having had enough of hearing from, effectively like the same voice over and over and over again?
I think you're not wrong. It's certainly in terms of politicians, but on the other hand, like in politics, there's a lot of discussion of how rather than what. So I would suggest the times of former spads going on the Sunday shows, that might be over. But on the other hand, you will still need spads. You'll still need data experts. You'll still need people to organise campaigns and sign off election returns and these sorts of things. And those sorts of people, if they have good long careers, they do end up in the Lords. They do end up advising senior politicians. It's a nice, it can be a nice place to be. They get kicked to think tanks, on it goes. So it does matter when people who are relatively young, relatively well educated, have options. It matters what party looks like it might end up in government, and so that's what I mean by careerists.
Yeah, right. And rhetoric, right? Like, rhetoric is also extremely important. It's like, whether it's Conservatives or Labour, like they need to get hold of the debate again, right? It can't just be Reform. I mean, credit where credit's due. Annoyingly, Nigel Farage is, well, he was, I'd say more so maybe than now, but very good at sort of punctuating that rhetoric and that narrative, a point that gets through, and everyone else seems to be responsive rather than, do the mainstream political parties need to get back on the front foot?
Alex, you take that first, because I'm working on it.
I think that's a very good point. I guess populism kind of in general can be kind of segmented into two things, can't it? As in, it's the typical academic kind of use of the term, which is, the people versus the elites as a sort of dichotomy of viewing politics. And there's the second one, which I think is kind of conflated quite a bit, which is populism as in politics is too complicated, we should make it as simple as possible. And I would say that, the Reform, I would say, I mean, certainly indulge a lot in the former. I would say that the worst aspect of Reform is that they do a lot of the latter. I think a lot of the yes, Nigel Farage is very good at communicating, things very clearly. That's also because the concepts that he communicates are very, simple. It's not that he's good at communicating difficult concepts. It's just he doesn't bother communicating difficult concepts at all. And I would, although I have some degree of sympathy with the rise of the Greens, I would say similar things about the Greens too. I would say that a lot of the attraction is the being against careerist politicians, but it is also the second thing, which is being against careerist politicians, not because we should have a democracy where everyone from all walks of life are represented, but against careerist politicians because they talk funny and they say weird, they use percentage points when they're referring to like political arguments. They're too technical and too wonkish, and those I think are the kind of discrete that's maybe a bit of a tangent, but I think those are the two things that people are annoyed about, and one is a lot more justifiable than the other, I guess.
Okay.
I just
Sorry,
want
Miles.
to, yeah. So I just want to attack like a very small point on that rhetoric. Is that for a long time Nigel Farage has had a question that he can pose to other politicians that they don't have an answer to. It's like, what are you going to do about immigration? And while other politicians have had answers, like the only ones that had a simple enough answer to answer Nigel Farage was the Conservatives, and they would say, "We're going to put them all on a plane to Rwanda." Um, I'm paraphrasing somewhat.
Oh,
Um,
kind. That was kind of their answer.
It's not too
and
much of an oversimplification.
Yeah.
and that did them no good.
Mm.
So I think, in terms of rhetoric, I think we need to find something that Nigel Farage doesn't want to answer and ask that. The problem is that immigration is a reason to be in government. If you want to change the immigration system, you have to be in government. You can't just find um, uh, Nigel, could you tell us about all of your mates and how many millions they've given you? That is a good attack, but it's not something you can build a whole political message around. You need to find a thing that you're going to be urgent about. If I were the Labour Party, I'd probably choose something like, I don't like inflation because I don't think governments can fix it very well. But you
Yeah.
could say housing. You could say housing. Look, I don't want to talk about immigration because I'm here focused on housing, and Nigel Farage has no answers for housing. What will Nigel do about bulldozing the green belt and building houses or whatever, like? But
Yeah.
the point of housing is that it's a like immigration. It's a tough policy to fix. There will be pain involved in fixing it. The difference is that and so like it's something that can take up political space, and I think trying to move the 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 argument on from immigration, trying to get off that ground. You can't ignore immigration, but uh, you're unlikely to come up with with an answer that is as sticky as Nigel's build a wall in the middle of the channel.
Yeah.
Sort of solutions. Like, is you're unable. It's just not a place where you're going to be able to say something that's satisfying. I don't know, perhaps.
Yeah. No. I would agree. Yeah. Moving on from that is, Alex, do you have anything to say to that point?
No, not at all, except for, I guess, an opposite wish for the ability of the Conservative Party to survive this. I am praying sadly for the downfall of the Conservative Party, so the Liberal Democrats can finally reign supreme on earth. But that's maybe a bit of an aside.
I think that's fair, but I think if you see a Conservative Party come back, they'll look a lot more Liberal Democrat than they have recently. I think from what you're from these last few years, yeah, I wouldn't be devastated for them, but any Liberal Democrats that can take the place of the Conservative Party will look somewhat different from the Liberal Democrats of today, and any Conservative Party that can fill up the space that it used to. Will also look a lot different from today. So we're in a transitional moment for sure.
So, couple more points. First point, tactically, right? arguably the Greens are taking votes away from Labour, Reform are taking votes away from Labour, Restore took votes away from Reform in Great Yarmouth. The Conservatives are losing votes to the Lib Dems and Reform. Everyone's it's a bit of an amalgamation here. When we're talking about an opposition, it seems like each party, it's quite a muddled picture there. And I suppose my question is, with all of the parties losing votes to each other, right? So 5 parties now all losing votes to each other because there's quite a lot of crossover there. We've talked about a credible opposition. What do so Reform, we can argue about exactly where they are statistically, but let's say 10% ahead, right, in the projected national share. What do the parties do to chip away at that without chipping away at each other effectively? How do they? Not that they really care. Like, obviously, the Greens don't care if they're taking votes away from Labour. They just care that they're getting votes, right? But what I mean is like, how do Reform lose points? How do the parties go about establishing? Because to your point, Alex, about before we got on air about Restore, obviously taking votes away from Reform. Can that be extrapolated across nationally? Can Restore be the threat? Are Restore the threat to Reform? Are the Greens the threat to Reform? Like, who's the threat to who?
I mean, I just on Restore, I guess. I think there's a, I mean, maybe going back to what Miles said a little bit earlier, about people not really knowing any of the kind of Reform MPs besides Nigel Farage. There was a poll back in March of 2025 when Rupert Lowe split off from Reform and founded Restore UK, which found that it was 14% of people could recognise Rupert Lowe from his photo. It's in the year since there was polling again in February of this year. That number, after he's started his own party, he's done all of this sort of canvassing and tried to kind of make him up. It's now down rather to 8%. It's fallen 6% in that time period. So it's not looking, great for Rupert Lowe in many ways. But I think, what we see from these local elections, a lot of people on the basis of that have kind of dismissed Restore as a sort of nothing party. They're polling at 4% nationally, and that 4% is half of the 8% who could recognize him from a picture. It's not a very high number of people who say that they're going to vote Restore. But what you see from these local elections, I think, you see 2 things really. They've targeted 8 council seats in 9 rather, in the Norfolk County Council, and they've won every single one of those. Or rather, Great Yarmouth first did, which is like I guess like an England first thing, except for like Great Yarmouth specifically. They want to kind of put them ahead of the rest of the UK, which has been leeching on them for so many years. But it's a sort of Restore UK affiliated group. So they basically they have an incredibly sort of intense, small but incredibly passionate, I guess, activist base of people, who are willing to go out and campaign for them and make sure that they can win in concerted areas if they focus all of their strength there. They sponsored a total of 12 independents. This isn't covered as much by the media in general, but also by Restore UK. They sponsored a bunch of independents. None of those independents won, but ones which were directly affiliated with Restore UK through this, which they focus all of their kind of strength on, they did quite well. I think the thing that you learn from this is the kind of damage is less in the sense of actually splitting the vote, but more kind of sapping, the young activist base of, not to be rude if there's any Restore UK people watching, but, like terminally online, the of that subset of 8% who know who Rupert Lowe is, the terminally online people who kind of post about him 24/7, they've got...
I believe David Cameron outlined the demographics quite accurately.
But it's interesting how many, like, they've got, a sort of an entire kind of ecosystem of sort of, far right. I don't think it's pejorative to say far right, kind of influencers aligned with Restore UK, who are willing and able to pump stuff out about them, but they're just not really able kind of to manifest that I think, at least we get from this, from the failure of the affiliated independents to do well, into a kind of national campaign with kind of, I guess, a national kind of appeal. But that doesn't mean that they can't be very damaging to Reform UK in kind of stealing off people, activist-wise, who might otherwise help Reform UK. That's my opinion.
Yeah,
Oh,
Miles?
yeah. My opinion is not a happy place. I see that that sort of influencer Super Bowl on the right. You know, that sort of tournament of people who are more engaging, and I also see it in the United States, and I just think that's the future. I think one of the reasons the right is doing so well is because they have an absolutely cutthroat, interesting, supported um, group of influencers on every social media channel who are grabbing more and more attention, and then those influencers are moving in and out um, of being candidates. And while there are downsides of that, if we have a quick look at Matt Goodwin, uh, sort of total charisma hole that appeals to nobody but the 5% of the people online who he does. But but uh, but the thing is that those sorts of people are going to be coming into politics more and more, and I think as the other parties become thinner and more based on that, and I think that that battle online is just going to heat up, and we're going to be fighting within our little identities. Everything's going to look like your party. What do you mean you're a Polanskiite? No, I'm a true Green supporter that only follows. Insert your favorite Green activists here. I think that stuff is coming for us all, and I think when we start taking chunks out of Reform, it will be because there is some new social media influencer, which is what I'd class like the majority of what Nigel Farage does as social media influencing. I think it'll be because a new one comes and tickles the fancy of a lot of people who were previously interested in Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage will have gotten somewhat stale. God, I've been waiting to have Nigel Farage stale for about several years now, but I do believe it will happen to an extent at least, and that's how you're going to take chunks out. I don't think it's going to be some great ideological realignment. I don't think anyone's going to release a book as to why Nigel Farage is wrong and the policies that could be done to. I just don't think that's happening. As much as I'd love it to, I just think we're in a tournament of influencers now until until we all learn how to live in this world.
Do we think there's a world in which a response to Reform could be like you're seeing in the well, hopefully. I mean, you never know really with the algorithm what the what the reality is, but you're seeing in the US a bit of a rebuttal to Trump. His approval ratings are low. He, I think it's well, if it's not widely acknowledged yet that Hegseth and Chris Patel and like these people are just bonkers. And shouldn't be allowed a pair of scissors, let alone the Defense Department of the most powerful country in the world. Can there be a response in which people just say, "Christ, we pushed the boat a bit far with this one"? And I hate this. Like I hate the line of, like, should we get the grown-ups back? Because like that's basically how Labour won an election and then didn't have a policy for however long.
Yeah.
But like, is there can the response to Reform be like, "God, imagine if we'd nearly got that"? Shall we not like, to your point, Miles, right at the beginning of the podcast, you said like, do I want fiscal policy from the Conservatives? Do I want, environmentalism from the Greens? Do I want? Like, do you think there could be a response in which people, because effectively this is a result of polarization, which is exacerbated by social media, and effectively people being more focused on like culture wars stuff than actually on politics, because like you said, Alex, politics is boring, and Nigel Farage screaming about boats is a better social media clip. But if this continues and they continue with the momentum, does sensible politics make a return? regardless of like what people think of centrist politics, and like I'm sure people have their criticisms of that as well. But
I I'm less certain. I'm gonna be strong and stake out a position. I don't think so. I don't think in the immediate future
Christ, so
that
you and
is.
Miles are both doom mongering.
It's really
You're
bad when
Or
Alex is the one.
yeah,
Alex, your job here is to tell us that no, we can win this. It's going to be sensible.
I mean, yes. I mean, I am more, I guess, materially focused on this than Miles, and therefore kind of think, these things are somewhat more soluble in the sense that, if you make things better, then less people will, fall to these ideas. I think in the short term, and by the short term, I think maybe a couple of decades. I think yes, you're right. You are seeing the complete collapse of Trump support. You're also seeing it collapse in a way which is, Donald Trump, he is bad because he isn't Tucker Carlson-y enough. The kind of collapse that you're seeing of Trump's base is that, oh yeah, well, I was never really in support of Trump the whole time. Trump is,
yeah, yeah,
this guy who, for years we have known to be a sort of a friend, a former associate of Jeffrey Epstein. Only now was it revealed to me. I mean, I secretly knew, but only now was it revealed to me that he was actually part of this evil deep state conspiracy. So actually, my ideology the whole time was even more vindicated than it was originally, because now the deep state conspiracy is so great that even Donald Trump is subsumed in it. And I think there is just going to be this kind of purity spiral of ever more and more kind of, deep statey sort of, oh yeah, well, we couldn't trust him. That means that we need to double down and be even more pure and kind of adherent to our beliefs. I think eventually that will get so kind of off track of what most people want that that's no longer electable. But I think in a two-party system like America, that will probably be a long period of time. That's my, I guess, doomerist kind of view, I suppose.
An awful thing we've come to where I have to be the voice of positivity. But here look, I'm going to try it. It's been a while.
I was going to say, you guys, it's not the first time ever that I've been the optimist of a conversation. That's quite an achievement. But yeah, go on, Miles.
So, sensible government, sensible politics. How do we get back to it? So there are two elements of that. So the first one is there a hunger for sensible politicians? And I do think, and here I think there is. I don't think that Labour will radicalise into similarly swivel-eyed loons, and I don't think the Liberal Democrats won't. There is, and I do think there's like an upper limit on like influencers, politicians. The problem is that upper limit may be well above what will get them into government, and whereas and so that's what we talk about sensible politics is like there was a time when both parties were broadly sensible and neither would drive us off a cliff, and that was a great time because it meant we could have political discussions, we could have political arguments, and we could argue about like individual policies, and we could try and make, there was often like a thing was like when somebody won an argument, like, oh, the Conservatives have adopted Labour's policy on this and the Labour have adopted the Conservative policy on that. And it was just a way of moving forward. But like none of those ways drove us off the road. And what I don't think is coming back is a time when we can, do I feel like voting today? Nah, I can't be bothered. Like, I don't think people like us are going to be doing that for a while because I think every election now, as it has been for almost 10 years, is going to be Russian roulette. I do think there will still be a sensible lane in politics, but there will also be a crazy lane. And a lot of the sort of questions about Trump now, and like Alex said, Trump's being questioned, and while his base, firstly, his support is like his approval rating is coming into the low 30s. This is not very low. This, like if this were 1998 and somebody came on a Trump platform, they would be a laughing stock. It would just not be a thing. But also, when Trump falls, there will be. It could be the end of, obviously it could mean that the Republicans are out of government for a long time. It could mean a lot of things, but we could be in for another Joe Biden-esque, or dare I say it, Keir Starmer-esque interlude before the before the tournament gives us the next inspiring, charismatic psychopath, and and then we're off to the races all over again.
Well, I mean, both MAGA and Reform are kind of cult of personality, right? I mean, they're kind of attached to these charismatic leaders, and like, is there anyone else under Trump who is as like arguably as votable? Like, I mean, like JD Vance is kind of like, you know, wiggling around at the minute, trying to detach himself and not detach himself and stay in power and yet still be at arm's length. And I didn't agree with Iran, but I'll do it if you say so, daddy. Like, weird sycophantic behavior. But like, where do we, like, do these parties have, I suppose, do they have the people underneath the cult of personality to take over? I mean, I think the gold statue of Trump was pretty gross, but a gold statue of Stephen Miller would be comfortably worse.
This is very true. It's hard to imagine, as you say, Stephen Miller leading the great, is Stephen Miller leading January 6th, for instance, being the charismatic leader who, yes, I think that's a really good point. I think that is a good point, but I think that, in the Trump, in the absence of Trumpism, I don't think is a reversion, certainly in the short term, to the kind of historical aberration, really, which was the Republican era from kind of 1988 to 2016. Really, I think that is, the kind of demographic shift that you are seeing in the Republican Party, where the younger Republicans have dramatically more extreme views on most things, and that they have also a highly conspiratorial view on most things. That I think that makes it, I guess the only kind of thing that makes me at all optimistic with that, with the fact that kind of from every year from now, Republicans of the kind of older generation of the McCain sort are being gradually replaced by a more kind of, populist wing, is that these people are so sort of conspiratorial in their mindsets that they may be kind of unable to group round any single leader without, kind of believing that they're part of, the kind of great conspiracy that controls it all. That's, I mean, I don't know. We'll have to see.
When a leader becomes the leader, it changes the maths. So suddenly they get in charge of patronage, all the bribes go to them, all of the jobs are given out by them. It does change, all of the interviews are given out by them. It changes the mathematics. So while currently we have like a load of people fizzing on the butt, so at the moment, obviously JD Vance and Marco Rubio want it. But if they get the nomination, I don't think either of them will win the presidency. Whereas if you've got people like Tucker Carlson, like what you're looking for is a charismatic, relatively rich person with their own platform already, ready to sort of. They won't reform the Trump coalition either. They will have to renounce parts of it and become their own coalition, and then suddenly, once one of those sort of grows up from the mire, then the mathematics of it will change, and if it's a brutal contest between Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, as soon as Candace wins, and you saw this in 2016, it was disgusting. You saw Trump insulting Ted Cruz's wife on stage, and then Ted Cruz making phone calls for him at the end. Like that is how it will happen, and there could be a knockdown, drag out fight that leads to like somebody ridiculous getting in power. But then as soon as they have that power, then everyone will pretend like they're not ridiculous.
I think that's probably quite a good place to end.
On that happy note.
On a really happy and funny note, have we all seen the pictures of Marco Rubio wearing shoes that Trump bought him because he likes them, and they're 2 sizes too big?
Cannot get enough.
I have
beautiful.
Again, fact check it maybe, but I hope I the idea, like Miles, if you bought me a pair of shoes that were 3 sizes too big, I had to wear them in order to carry on doing the podcast, I would I'd respectfully decline it.
Right now, but when I come to power, soon everyone will be wearing the wrong size shoes. It will be great.
Yeah. Right, guys, thanks for listening. If you want more podcast episodes, head to Pod the Beacon on YouTube. If you want more in-depth deep dives, head to Watch the Beacon of Alex, and head to Substack if you want to read any of our content or where all our content is hosted on our website. But yeah, we'll be back next week for another roundup, and thanks for listening.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.